record our talk today. Let me see. Let me start the share. Am I recording it currently? Yeah. Did you get a note or yeah, you got yeah, oh yeah,
Yeah.
you go. Yeah, it shows me that I'm recording. Okay, great. Okay, we are at the right moment to start. So, please join me in welcoming Professor Hussein Solomon to our class here and University of Houston. It's part of a larger course that we are conducting about African geopolitics. And Hussein, your lecture is one of the highlights of our course, and we are very excited for it. It's a very timely topic, of course, and feel free to even go more to the basics, as because um, we did cover some broad themes like ethnicity, climate, economic challenges, and we talked a little bit about the Sahel. But we are still relatively at the beginning of the course. We're about a third or almost half of the course, so you're coming in a great time for us. Let me please introduce you all to our guest lecturer today, Professor Solomon. So Dr. Hussein Solomon is a senior professor in the Center for Gender and Africa Studies at the University of the Free State in South Africa. He previously served as academic head of the Department of Political Studies and Governments at the same university. Over the course of his career, he has held research and teaching positions at institutions including the University of Pretoria, the Institute for Security Studies, and King's College London, and has been a visiting professor at universities in Japan, India, and elsewhere. Professor Solomon is leading scholar on African security, terrorism, and international relations. He has authored or co-authored numerous books and articles on topics such as political Islam, conflict and security in Africa, and global terrorism. His recent publications include books on African security, terrorism trends, and the relationship between climate change and international politics. We are very happy and honored to have you here, straight from South Africa, Professor Solomon, and the stage is all yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lubotzky. It's actually wonderful to be able to share some of my research on this issue. I really thank you, Dr. Lubotzky, for the invitation to the University of Houston. I have to admit, that I've never visited Houston, but it holds a special place in my heart as the birthplace of Beyonce. I did, however, get to visit my second special place in the US, which is West Reading, Pennsylvania, the birthplace of Taylor Swift. And yes, I do confess that I'm a Swiftie as well. So, what I'm going to be trying to do now is to briefly trace the origins of Islamic State from its rise in the Middle East to its expansion and growth in Africa, and provide some reasons why local groups have joined its black banner. And I would like to, maybe after a very pessimistic analysis, I would maybe like to conclude on a more optimistic note, if that's possible. So let's go back to the origins of Islamic State, going back to 1999 with the Jordanian militant Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who established Al-Qaeda in the land of the two rivers, of course, that is Euphrates and Tigris. And of course, the name was a bit cumbersome. It then changed to AQI, Al Qaeda in Iraq, and then the differences between Al Qaeda and AQI over tactics occurred. There was also some personality differences, and you had a split and the formation of Islamic State in Iraq. You go to the 2011 civil war in Syria, and ISI saw this as an opportunity to expand, and it was renamed Islamic State in Greater Syria, or ISIS. And ISIS grew phenomenally off proceeds from illicit oil. They actually controlled large territory and started to govern this territory with a cabinet of ministers, ministries, and various other government departments. And that gave them the hubris to call itself the Islamic State. Now, that the Islamic State suggests two things. First, like the global Ummah, there's no geographical boundaries to their state. And two, the suggests they're the only Islamic State which all Muslims owe their allegiance to. So let's move to Islamic State in Africa. So in 2017, of course, IS loses control over Raqqa. 2019, they lose control over Baghouz in Syria, and you have the end of Islamic State essentially there. They now seem to be making a comeback in Syria, but that's outside of the fold of our talk. But before its fall, before the development of 2017 and 2019, already by 2015, they had established affiliates in 17 African and Middle East countries. Most uh, of all Islamic State attacks, in fact, 90% of all Islamic State attacks occurring globally takes place in Africa. In just 1 week, from the 6th to the 13th of March 2025, right? Just 1 week last year. Of the 28 Islamic State attacks globally, 25 of them were in Africa. So what I want to do in this lecture is to basically ask, why did they expand so rapidly and so effectively in Africa? So IS expansion into Africa, they capitalized on porous borders, poor and malevolent governance, and existing sectarian tensions. Initially, Islamic State focused on North Africa, but now that's less of an issue, and I'll explain later why. And Islamic State now operates across the continent, across the African continent, via its 8 official wilayats or provinces. So these are your Central Africa province, your Greater Sahara province, your West Africa province, Mozambique province, Sahel province, and so forth. Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Niger, and Nigeria has borne the brunt of Islamic State carnage in West Africa and the Sahel. In the case of the DRC, it is Ituri, Benin, and North Kivu, which has suffered under the onslaught of Islamic State Central Africa province. IS Somalia is expanding in the Bari region of Puntland, and IS Mozambique is growing in northeastern Mozambique. IS, of course, makes very effective use of social media tools to recruit thousands. And this is easier to do. I mean, in my view, social media is one thing, but people have to be receptive to social media recruitment. So many of Africa's citizens are confronted with rapacious states, venal political elites. Many African citizens are left to fend for themselves. Now, when IS franchises begin operating in a particular area, they start providing rudimentary assistance to local villages, basic farm tools, the establishment of religious schools, the provision of basic health facilities. And quickly, loyalty to the state is replaced by fealty to the militant group. I also think another reason why Islamic State has been expanding is how effectively they've exploited existing conflict dynamics within African states. So in Libya, there was a conflict between the rival Tuareg and Tibu tribes, and Islamic State sided with Tuaregs, who were then formally recruited into Islamic State and used to penetrate the Sahelian states via their kinship networks. If you go to a place called Tilbury in Niger, there was creeping desertification, which put pressure on arable land, which was exacerbated by demographic pressures. Violence soon erupted between the Gerber, who are farmers, and the nomadic Fulani and Dasuk, and from this, ethnic militias were formed. Now, the state, the government of Niger, was powerless to stop this, and I think worse, they supported certain groups over others. So Islamic State, under the charismatic leadership of Abu Walad al-Sarawi, unites these different groups, saying their real enemy was the Nigerian states, was the state of Niger. And so you have these ethnic militias, which then became part of Islamic State Greater Sahel. I think another reason for their expansion has been the issue of indiscriminate state violence. So there was a study which I think it was called Journeys Through Extremism by the United Nations Development Program, and it was a survey of militants who were captured across Africa, and they asked them a simple question, right? What was the catalyst for joining extremist organizations? 71%, 71% said that the catalyst for joining extremist organizations was the killing of a family member or friend by security services. And this indiscriminate state violence continues, right? So in March last year, there's a village called Tatali in the Central African Republic. And one of the soldiers of CAR, the Central African Republic, was killed near this village. And you had CAR soldiers together with Russian Africa Corps personnel surrounding this village, and for a week conducted a revenge campaign against all Muslim citizens in this village. Now, these brutal tactics also followed similar tactics by the Africa Corps and local forces in northern Mali. Interestingly, it was aptly named Operation Revenge. And there was a very interesting study on this by TRAC, the Terrorism Research and Analysis Consortium. And they had this to say, and I'm quoting them here: the mission failed to meet any strategic objective. Okay, they just terrorized hapless villagers. But I do believe that they contributed to the radicalization of citizens and recruitment into Islamic State. Now, let's deal with this question. Why would local African groups join Islamic State Central, as it were? Beyond providing ideological and operational guidance to their affiliates, IS also provides them with small amounts of money and assists in upgrading military capabilities, contributing to there being more lethal insurgent forces. ISWAP, the Islamic State in West Africa Province's success, could be attributed to the strategic advice they receive from IS Central, who also allowed operational decisions to be made by local commanders who had better knowledge of the terrain. So IS Central transitioned ISWAP from WhatsApp to Telegram because of greater encryption. They provided advice on religious doctrine because the area in which they were inhabiting was largely Sufi Islam. And they also provided and they focused on internal organization, bringing structure and discipline to a ragtag militia. IS Central also assisted ISWAP to convert artillery shells into ammunition for AK-47s and provided them with the drones and skill sets to fly them for surveillance. IS Central also sent military trainers to assist the ISWAP. One defector from Islamic State, West Africa Province, said that on one occasion, 8 Arab fighters arrived and provided training in the Sambisa forest Here they were trained to move away from suicidal infantry charges to more maneuverable, smaller guerrilla units, which were better trained, armed, and coordinated. They were also schooled on anti-aircraft techniques and how to respond to armor deployments. Now, excuse me, let me turn to another issue facilitating the expansion, and that's the issue of terrorist financing. Now, no terror group can thrive without the necessary financial resources. Without funds, there's no weapons or vehicles which can be purchased, no recruits remunerated, no official bribe, no safe houses acquired. IS has been extremely creative in acquiring funds, from extortion to kidnapping, smuggling, and the like. ISWAP also receives funds every 2 weeks with amounts from $10,000 to $100,000 through the transfer to individuals and companies in Nigeria and by sending Nigerian couriers to Saudi Arabia and the UAE and collecting money from benefactors. IS Somalia, by the way, plays a key role in connecting Islamic State funding from Islamic State Khorasan, which is Afghanistan, all the way south to my own country, South Africa. Let me turn to briefly focus on the South African connection. So, Islamic State in South Africa raises funds through criminal activities, kidnapping, extortion, robberies, narco trafficking, and the movement and sale of precious minerals. And there was an interesting police statistic pointing out that the number of kidnapping cases in South Africa this past quarter doubled to 4,000 compared to the previous quarter. Now, remember what I said there. It's reported cases because not all cases where a family member is kidnapped and you pay the ransom or something, do you get the police involved because you really don't want to report it because you don't want any harm on that family member. In addition to that, 6.3 billion rand was wired from South Africa to Bangladesh, Kenya, Nigeria, using 57,000 phone SIM cards between 2020 and 2021. All these SIM cards were unregistered, even though by South African law it had to be registered. So that's one of the other problems you have on the African continent. Sometimes you have great laws, but you have lousy enforcement of these laws. And there's a growing nexus between crime and terrorism, and this is made much worse by endemic corruption. Okay. Let me turn to another issue which is causing problems and causing the expansion of IS, and that's the failure of African counterinsurgency efforts. So Islamic State has expanded on account of failed national and regional counterinsurgency efforts. And Islamist insurgency started in northern Mozambique in early 2016. But SADC, that's the regional body, the Southern African Development Community, took 5 years to deploy a force in northern Mozambique. And when they thought of deploying such a force, they thought of a force of only 2,900 for a mission which was envisaged to neutralize Islamic State Mozambique and restore law and order. So that meant holding territory, right? But this force of 2,900 was insufficient given the size and the nature of the terrain. Also, eventually, when the force was eventually deployed, it was only deployed with 1,900 personnel. So the 2,900 was already too little. Now it was 1,000 personnel short. And still, when the force was deployed, there was no helicopters, no air transport or intelligence assets. And this was envisaged in the plan for what was called SAMIM, the Southern African Mission in Mozambique. To make matters worse, there was little coordination and indeed some rivalry between the Southern African Mission in Mozambique, SAMIM, Mozambican armed forces, and the Rwandan forces already there. So the insurgency has gained in strength. Okay. Now, so if that all sounds a bit negative to you, let me maybe focus on or try to sound positive in terms of my conclusion. I think that Islamic State is struggling to maintain control over local affiliates. Okay. IS Central, for example, sent fighters trained in Libya to ISWAP as enforcers um, when these were becoming too independent, and they killed popular ISWAP commanders like Mamun Noor and Ba Idrissa. And this caused unrest amongst the rank and file, and this has resulted in a decreased fighting efficiency. So ISWAP has been retreating from some of its territories, right? There's also a rivalry between, as you know, between Islamic State and Al Qaeda. And the local Al Qaeda aligned group was former Boko Haram fighters who are now grouped as JAS fighters, JAS, and they've wrested control from ISWAP over areas like the Lake Chad Basin, the Mandera Mountains, and Sambisa forests. And the same is happening between Islamic State Somalia and Al-Shabaab, which is aligned to Al-Qaeda. So Al-Shabaab is now going on the offensive against IS Somalia. And you would recall that I started off by talking about when IS started to expand into Africa, they focused on North Africa. But what was interesting is that with the exception of Libya, which, as you know, is a failed state, it's divided and so forth. I mean, IS has tried to make inroads in terms of Algeria and Morocco, but the security forces rooted them out. ISLs, and these ISLs will launch when are launched like this week, and within a month they were already destroyed, which suggests that the security forces there have been quite effective in terms of with their intelligence assets conducting focused operations, not engaging this kind of indiscriminate violence that the Sahelian states have been prone to do. And they've destroyed these ISLs in Algeria and Morocco. And so what I take from that is that effective security forces can beat Islamic State, and that's great. But beyond beating them in terms of the military aspects, there's also, as I pointed out in terms of the UNDP survey, there's also the issue about governance, and there's the issue about economic development. So with that, I'm going to end, and I hope that was okay.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much. So I do have a few questions, and in the meantime, I'll also encourage all the participants to think of questions of their own regarding anything connected to jihadism on the continent of Africa. My main question, and you did maybe touch on it a bit, but I would like to hear maybe a bit more. If so, we do have a few provinces in Africa, right? We do have, as you mentioned them. My question is whether we see more of a common dominator between them, or more of differences and the localized conditions are more prominent than the common kind of dominator of being a part of IS, of the Islamic State. And whichever it is, my question is, why then? Why do we see it like that? So, thank you.
That's a good question, but it's also a very complicated question. Many of these groups started off motivated by local conditions, okay, local grievances and so on. As I gave the example in Niger, where you have these different ethnic militias trying to actually deal with access to arable land. That was their primary focus. And IS has been quite good at uniting them and moving them towards attacking the local Satan, if I can put it that way. Okay. But what I find really, really interesting about both Al Qaeda franchises and Islamic State franchises in the African continent is that you won't find the global narrative coming out strongly in terms of their communications, what they put out and so on. People are not talking about, for example, the US that much. People, I mean, of course, when the US supports the local government, then that becomes a bit of a problem. But no one is like opposed to the West as a broad idea. For that matter, the issue about the current Middle East conflict, and I'm not necessarily just talking about Iran, which is the issue of Shia Islam and these guys being Sunni, but even the question of Israel-Palestine. These things don't come out in terms of the local context. There's also and that raises a very, very interesting perspective from a counterterrorism perspective. Because if there were these local groups being formed due to local grievances, why couldn't counterterrorism, broad counterterrorism, not the military, not just the military side, try to put a cleavage between these local groups and these international terror groups, right? So I don't think enough has been done. And to be honest with you, I think that the current administration, the US administration, has made things worse by talking about Christian genocide in Nigeria and so on and so forth. Okay. Um, the other issue that you raise uh, is the relationship between different groups, right? So uh, on the one side of it, there's the fact that, for example, the money that is collected and South Africa has become the major fundraiser for Islamic State across Africa. So the money collected in South Africa goes to Somalia, interestingly enough, goes to IS in Somalia. And from there, it's dispersed to the other African IS franchises. Okay, so IS Mozambique, IS Central African Province, and so forth. So I find this very interesting. So there is a level of coordination between IS. So, for example, the insurgency in northern Mozambique has help from Islamic State Central Africa Province, that's DRC, and from Somalia, okay, from IS Somalia. But at the same time, there is tension between groups because sometimes their territories overlap. So you have Islamic State in the Greater Sahel, and then you have Islamic State West Africa Province. Okay, and so they're also expanding, and there's also the personality differences between leaders, each one trying to be their own little feudal lord over their own little fiefdom and stuff like that. And I don't think that counterterrorism does enough work on these issues. Uh, I hope that somehow helps with with your answer.
Yes, definitely, definitely. So thank you very much. If we have any other, I do have more questions, but I want to maybe let some people in the audience here. We do have a few questions here. Thank you. Okay, so we have a question from Santiago, and then we have a question from Kin. Kin sent it directly to me, so I can read it out loud. But let's start with Santiago's question. Hussein, you can see it in the chat. Thank you so much for being here, Professor. You mentioned the role of Saudi benefactors as an important portion of IS financing in Africa. What is the policy of the current Saudi government towards these dynamics? That's a very good question, actually, very timely also. Would love to hear this, and after that, we have more questions.
Okay, so Saudi Arabia, uh, uh, from at least the 1980s, was pushing this Salafist view. I mean, they were doing it in terms of globally, of course. And in Africa, it became quite prominent in terms of Saudi mosques sending out a particular message and so on and so forth. And to the best of my knowledge, the Saudis have stopped that. There's been major changes in Saudi Arabia. You know, I'm not sure if you would regard this as a major thing, but hey, women can drive, and so on and so forth. Okay, so they've been trying to kind of reform and not pushing this out. They've been sort of cooling down on this radicalism and so on and so forth. But you must understand, it's very hard to you have this imam at a mosque talking about jihad against the infidels. Christians are like this one's like that. These are idolaters. Sufis uh, uh, are practicing bid'ah. They are praying at saints and this and that. All this is wrong. Attack the Sufis and so on. And then because there are changes in Saudi Arabia, you suddenly have uh, now you're singing a different message. There's no clash of now civilizations. We can all be brothers. Hallelujah. Let me make this big uh, city in the middle of the desert, the line, or whatever, right? There is a delay in terms of it. But when I talk about Saudi benefactors here, I'm not talking about the Saudi state. I'm talking about Saudi donors, individual donors from Gulf countries who are still purveying this ideology, right, and assisting these particular groups. And I think that more can be done by Gulf countries to shut down the funding. You would recall what I said about the funding ISWAP gets from Gulf countries. So I think more needs to be done to close the taps completely, not even the drip, drip, drip from happening. Uh, yeah.
All right, there is another question. So there is a perception that African Islam is a bit more, moderate, kind of more spiritual, kind of Sufi-like, right? And on the one end, on the other end, we do see jihadism, as you say, kind of thriving, and we do understand its local grievances, but still, maybe it means something about the perception. Maybe the perception was wrong, right? But do you see, how do you explain this radicalization that did happen, apparently pretty quickly, right? If we said that this kind of jihadism is maybe kind of an import from outside in a way, right? So those ideas at least. So how would you explain that?
I would say to you two things, and it might sound contradictory. There is definitely an importation, not just, by the way, from the Sunni Gulf states, but also Iran, for example, in terms of their support for Shia groups like the Islamic movement of Nigeria. I mean, those guys tried to kill the Nigerian chief of staff, to give you an idea what I'm talking about. Um, and that has worsened the problem. But you know, I've historically been looking at this issue for at least the past 30 years. And there's always been a tension between the Sufi Islam, which is a syncretic Islam, okay, and the Salafi Islam. But we must also understand that Sufi Islam can also turn to violence, you know. I mean, I was quite shocked because I always thought Buddhists were pacifists until I encountered Myanmar and what those Buddhists were doing there. I thought these nut jobs are everywhere. So if you look historically at, yeah, I mean, have you heard of the Mahdi in terms of Sudan, in terms of in terms of fighting the British? I mean, if you look at Uthman Danfodio in this Fulani guy in the early 19th century, I think 1808. Uthman Danfodio was also Sufi, ostensibly Sufi, but he perpetuated a certain view, and he created a Sokoto state, a caliphate, which still exists now. Uh, um, uh, the other thing um, that um, yeah, I think the best view is to understand that all religions and every religion produces its nut jobs, right? Uh, uh, and it you must understand it within a particular context and within a particular time frame. Um, you know, and 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 that's how you need to view this. But I do think the kind of Salafi Islam which came from the Gulf states uh, did not sit well in terms of the locals, which is why they had to send Islamic State Central had to send uh, propaganda officers, indoctrination officers to tell people what their deen is, what their faith is, because these guys were not confused. Yeah, I see there's a number of other questions in the chat function there.
Yes, maybe let's. I see Eddie wanted to ask something, so let's let Eddie ask a question, and then we'll go back to the chat.
Asher, I see there's so many questions from your students. Maybe I should just step back and let the students interact.
Okay, we can take a few more. That's totally fine though. We do have the time, so but okay,
Should I
let's.
just go around through the? Oh, okay, yeah, yeah.
Do you want me to ask the question, Asher?
Yeah,
Okay.
sure. Go ahead. Go
All right.
ahead.
All right. So, Dr. Solomon, maybe I don't know if this is a statement or a question. You can decide. When I say we, I also don't know exactly who on the call would be included in the state in the word we, but we are fighting an ideology, a radical, violent Islamic extremist groups that have hijacked the Islamic faith, and that are bent on changing Western values and way of life. So we're confronted with this ideology, and maybe if we, I see it's been revised, but the Hamas constitution, it's a covenant, a charter, came out in 1988. I see they've updated it somewhat in 2017 to remove the explicit anti-Semitic language of the 88 charter, so that they won't focus on the Jewish folks because of their religion, but more on the occupation project, right? But here's my question or statement. In fighting an ideology against these groupings that have hijacked the Islamic faith, where does one start? Because it's so complex. They need new recruits all the time to continue on with this ideological warfare, and so really the counterterrorism efforts should start at the grassroots. How does one even go about countering the recruitment efforts by highly sophisticated online psychologists who work as consultants for these groups that focus and target disillusioned youth across the world to work for them and to give them a home, to give them a family. Those who feel very much out in that feel isolated. So they have sophisticated psychological methods to identify these, such people who eventually become recruits and then fight for the cause. There's no single kinetic force that can fight against that. So it really becomes super complex. I'll stop there and just, I know I've touched on a few things. You can answer what you want to.
Thank you. If you don't mind, by the way, Dr. Lubotzky, this is Professor Mini. He is at the University of North Georgia. Okay, so
Yeah.
I should say that to you. If you don't mind, Eddie, I'm going to link your question to a question that Jimmy posed in the chat because I think it's the same question, which is what would you say is the United States' best course of action to turn off the tap? Would it be more preventative like development aid that help local communities or complete financial terrorism? So let me just say this to the audience first of all. I'm a practicing Muslim as well. I happen to also have, because of my surname, you all may have gathered, my paternal grandfather was Jewish, a Greek Jew, okay, which makes me maybe suffering from schizophrenia. But here's the reality. So these radical groups grow within a context. The state isn't providing anything, right? And it's ostensibly a secular state. In fact, it's rapacious, it's authoritarian, and so on. And then what do external actors do? Whether it's the case of the Americans or the Russians, it really doesn't matter. What do? They support this political elite. And they want to go and fight against it, which radicalizes them first, and so on. And remember, the state doesn't provide anything. One of the things in terms of Islam that at least it points to is the issue of social justice. It's about caring, etc., etc. And so you look at this rapacious elite, and you can talk about democracy and so on, but you can't eat democracy, and you can't build a house with democracy, and so on and so forth. These are the conditions in terms of Africa. And I think there needs to be a more critical engagement with these states. But here's the problem. There's a new scramble for Africa. And so if the Americans say, well, there needs to be democracy, there needs to be this or good governance or something, well, the Chinese don't care. The Russians don't care. The Turks don't care, right? So you have the scramble. Do you want influence or do you want and short-term stability, or do you want to have no influence and therefore no long-term stability either? It's a bit of a big thing. So you are sitting in the States, Eddie, and so are the students. And this is linked to the question about local communities. I've been a big supporter of USAID, okay, and so on. And I've witnessed what they were doing on the ground, mediating between disputes, various development projects, and so on. It was gutted by the Trump administration, in my view, for no good reason, right? There's another problem which also strengthens the radical ideology. I'm a secular Muslim, and I'm a secular Muslim because I believe that secularism, and please, not French style, I hate French style secularism. What's it, laïcité, right? It's just horrendous. But I'm a firm believer in secularism because it allows for people of different faith or no faith to coexist. Okay? And the problem, I'm sorry, I'm going to call it as I see it. I mean, when you hear the Secretary of War, sorry, not Defense, having these prayer meetings, talking about revelations and the end times, and God has anointed Trump, and this kind of stuff, you know. I mean, all the complaints. I forget the office in the US, but it was reported in US media, has on this. And if that's the mindset that you're sending troops to in Nigeria, and you talk about a genocide and a Christian genocide, and yes, Christians are being killed, but more Muslims are being killed. Sufi shrines are desecrated along with Christian churches, right? You have a problem. You then have these religious ideologues on the African continent pointing that you see this is a jihad. They're against your faith. And yeah. So that's what I would say to you.
Oh, thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a few questions that are interesting. I'm kind of like maybe merging a few of them. I see there is an interest in Shia in Africa, maybe because of the war now. So I mean, IS is of course Sunni, and
Yeah.
but you did mention that there are also Shia organizations. Can you maybe say something about Shia radicalism, radical Shiism, however you want to call it, in Africa, and also what are its links to Iran? And I see somebody ask Aiden, I think, if that means if Iran goes down, the Islamic regime in Iran goes down, of course. What does it mean for those kind of movements in Africa? We also know that Iran invested a lot in kind of cultivating those communities. So, what is your take on that?
So I would speak in the same way that I would speak about Shiism, that I would speak, well, first of all, obviously Sunni Islam is much more prevalent. I mean, I think it's like 90% of the population. So you're talking about a very tiny kind of groupings of Shia around. And then it's important, to explain that there are different kinds of Shiism. Okay. You know what was interesting for me to go back to the 1979 Islamic Revolution is that when Ayatollah Khomeini came to Iran, back from his exile, I think it was France, okay, and um, and he was talking about this religious doctrine of Velayat Fakhri, which is rule of the supreme jurisprudent, or I would call it an Iranian version of Plato's philosopher king on steroids. But there was many Shia, religious Shia, and the Ayatollah Khomeini was a religious cleric. There were many other Shia clerics in Iran who was opposed to this, right? Um, they were opposed to it because there was a quietist tradition in Shiism as well. Because there's an argument that if you mix religion and politics is dirty, religion is ostensibly pure, then the religion becomes dirty, you know. Um, and uh, and and so there are Shiite groups across Africa, and they're a tiny minority, but who have different things. But if I have to talk, like I mentioned, the Islamic movement in Nigeria, which violently wanted to arrest Paul, which was just madness. If you're thinking of 1 in 4 Africans is Nigerian, and you're talking about a tiny group as well, it was the most ridiculous nonsense ever. And I don't know why Iran played with them, frankly, because I think it was going to hurt them, because you don't mess with, I mean, for all of its faults and all of its weaknesses, Africa's behemoth, okay, being Nigeria. There are Shia groups in my own country, largely in terms of, in the Western Cape region. And of course, they've been quite loud in terms of the issue of Israel-Palestine, support for Hamas, and all of these particular things. Um, but then of course there's the Lebanese diaspora across, especially West Africa and parts of South Africa, Central Africa, and where Hezbollah is operating, in terms of conflict diamonds and, all of these kinds of things, the movement of these illicit goods and stuff like that. If you're interested, you can Google me and where I talk about Hezbollah and stuff like that. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you very much. We have a few interesting questions. One of them is Santiago mentions that you see in other places, like Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, that a lot of middle classers, right? A lot of middle class people or educated individuals are joining the movements. Do you see this also in Africa? Or is it a more kind of a working, peasant, herders, and so on?
I think in terms of Africa, it is actually not so much a urban phenomena in terms of the educated urban. It's largely in the rural areas. The idea is that, if you're educated, if you have a job and all of that, and you provide for yourself, states never do. The African continent provide anything in terms of, public goods and stuff like that. Um, uh, you have a vested interest in the status quo and not having these guys coming in, right? Because there are rollbacks. I mean, if you talk about the issue of gender, uh, um, okay, in terms of gender and stuff like that, all of those are kind of rolled back. Uh, um, there are certain things which you are not. I mean, this notion, for example, like Boko Haram, the book is forbidden, Western education is forbidden. In the urban groups actually regard education as a means to escape poverty and start a business and all of these things. Um, what is interesting in terms of I'll just say this in passing about the Middle East, which I know less about than because my focus has always been on the African continent. It kind of reminds me, of communists, right? I mean, find a working class communist for me. It's kind of difficult. What I'm trying to say to you, it's Karl Marx, an intellectual. It's Friedrich Engels, who's an industrialist. It is Che Guevara, who's a medical doctor. you know, yeah, and there are particular reasons for that. Um, but the other thing which I would mention is that what's far more prevalent, and as I explained in my lecture, is the issue of ethnic groups, right? Whole ethnic groups joining up. That's a little bit more problematic. Again, it's around specific issues, armed conflict around issues of arable land, as I explained, and so forth. That is quite prevalent, yes.
All right, we have a question from Joseph about financing. You said you mentioned Somalia. I think you mentioned it in more like kind of a receiving end, right? Less than like fundraising there. But I mean, I'm gonna take Joseph's question and kind of ask about financing in the West. So Joseph specifically asked about Somalis in the West, but like it's true for any kind of ethnic group, right? Or any kind of people. Do we see a lot of money comes from the West to jihadist groups in Africa, or not really? 'Cause you did mention South Africa, right? But
No,
not
no, I mean,
really.
South Africa is part of Africa. In
Right,
terms of,
right.
yeah, when I was talking about those 57,000 SIM cards being used in South Africa and the money going to all of these countries, especially Somalia, where the money was then redistributed, it was that Islamic State in Puntland doing the distribution. I don't know how this came about, but the IS Somaliland, so Somalia, seems to be the chief financial officers of Islamic State in terms of distribution and so on. But to the best of my knowledge, there isn't money going to Islamic State from the West. There was some talk about money coming in terms of money being repatriated and some of the money going to Al-Shabaab in the past. But I don't know if that's still the case or if those things have been closed.
Okay, all right, thank you. Let me see if we have some other question. Yahir asked about clashes between IS groups and other Islamists or other jihadists, like, he specifically mentioned Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab, but,
Yeah.
you can think of others. So,
Yeah.
those kind of things are those also, I mean, I'm adding to this question, is it also based on local grievances, those clashes, or is there kind of ideological competition here,
I
as well?
think, of course, they frame it as an ideological competition and so on. But issues of ethnicity matter. But I'll tell you something which matters even more. In my presentation, I spoke about the criminal enterprises which keeps them going, right? So, narco trafficking, gun running, smuggling, I mean, human people smuggling, and all of these things. But guess what? Like any criminal enterprise, they also fight for control and they fight about money, right? Many of them, many of these guys who were recruited, they already had criminal records and stuff like that. And then they join up and it just gives them a cover to carry on with pillaging and raping and doing whatever they're doing now, but now under the cover of some sort of religious doctrine. Um, yeah.
All right, thank you very much. Let's see if we have any other. Well, there are questions about that they're a bit less the purview of this talk, but if you do want to address them, that would be great. There's a question about Sudan I saw. There was a question about um, the conflict in the Middle East, I think. I can't find it now. I think our Keen asked. Um, is it possible for Africa? Africa is kind of a role in the kind of the war specifically now. I don't know where you can want to take this question, where you can take it to many directions, right? Um, so I mean, if you want to address those, that's great. If not, it's okay because we will actually have sessions about those kind of the Middle East and
Yeah.
Sudan and so
Okay.
on. I mean, talking about Sudan, actually, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, that's actually something I'm thinking about this now. Although there is obviously a large, very large, I mean, majority um, Muslim population in Sudan, and you do have Islamic kind of Islamist groups, mostly I think aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood. At least that's what I hear from the Emirates. Um, but I don't really remember having there an ISO and Al Qaeda chapter. Right? So is it
Yeah.
do you have an explanation for?
Well, first of all, historically, there's been two forces which have been the most extremely strong in Sudan. One is one is uh, the military, and the other hand is religious or fundamentalist political Islam. Okay, those have been the two strong forces. The question is about the UAE, and the short answer is that the UAE is involved and they're trying to get to support General Hemeti. There was also news reports about them taking gold out of Sudan and stuff like that. Uh, um, but what I find interesting in terms of, and of course, there were lots of Christian uh, um, Sudanese, but many of them are now in South Sudan when it's separated, as you know. Um, you mentioned Al Qaeda. Well, one of the interesting things in terms of Al Qaeda was Osama bin Laden was stationed in Sudan, right? And in 1998, Osama bin Laden was behind the first Al Qaeda attack. The first Al Qaeda attack was on African soil. It was planned in Sudan, okay? It was planned in Sudan, and they attacked the US embassies in Dar es Salaam and in Nairobi in 1998, okay? But you see these terror groups, they also need a functioning state. I don't mean now, sure, a weak state, but there needs to be certain things working, right? Uh, and the problem with Sudan, it has so collapsed. It doesn't provide that for them. And in terms of the midst of the civil war and all of that stuff. And I think one of the challenges in terms of the international community, and this is what I find extremely problematic, is that they're talking about Burhan, the one general, or the other general, Hemeti, who's opposed to him, right? But you are talking about, since Bashir staged his coup in 1989, ruled by generals. What about civil society? What about strengthening civil society? What about going back to civilian rule, right? Um, no one is really talking about that. The mediation between the two generals, even if they joined together, they formed, I don't know, some joint military junta and say, okay, right, I'll take the east, you take the west, I'll take the north, you take the south, whatever. It's not going to bring about stability or security there. But I think the problem in terms of Sudan is the fact that there's so many crises going on right now in the world. Whether you talk about Ukraine, you talk about the Middle East, you don't know if China is going to make use of the opportunity and take Taiwan. I could go on. There are endless cases, right? Um, and people's attention has shifted, right? Oh, I mean, the international community's attention has shifted from Africa. I mean, we're a sideshow. I mean, I'm watching South African channels. I don't even know what's happening in my own parliament, but I know what's happening in terms of Tel Aviv being struck or Tehran, there's a new supreme leader or whatever, right? In terms of Africa, African security architecture, Africa cannot, here's the sad bit, no matter how much I hate, and I do hate, all the various efforts at foreign intervention because they've messed things up even further. The Africans themselves have messed things up. The African Union is entirely dysfunctional. The various regional economic communities, I gave the example about Mozambique, they have not been able to secure peace in their respective neighborhoods. ECOWAS, which is this other big structure, the Economic Community of West African States, has now split into a sort of a pro-Western ECOWAS and then a pro-Russian alliance of Sahelian states, right? It is a mess. We are not dealing with this issue either at a national level. We are not dealing with this issue regionally, and we definitely not doing it continentally. I doubt if Africa can actually play a leadership role on the global stage, given the fact that our own house is in disarray.
Thank you so much. I think those are very powerful, very powerful message to kind of conclude our talk. Our students, my students, will have more opportunity to also ask me questions. That you can also email me questions for Professor Solomon, and I can email it to him. And we will have more opportunities, just us, to discuss other cases of jihadism and on the continent. So, in this note, I really want to thank you, Professor Solomon. That was a very, very interesting conversation, very interesting talk. Something that and it's wonderful to hear your perspective. It was also, first as an expert, but also as somebody who's also coming from, as you said, coming from Africa, right? South Africa, and much closer than us. to those affairs, and also as a man of Muslim faith, right? It's very interesting to hear your perspective on all of those things. Um, so thank you, and thank everybody, also the external guests who joined us, Eddie among others, and all our students who were here. And we hope to keep a collaboration, all of us, and have peace both in Africa and Middle East and everywhere else in the world. That doesn't seem very likely right now, but it might happen maybe in a few years. So, all right. So thank you very much, Professor.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
me. It was great. Thank you
Thank,
all.
thank
Thanks.
you. Thank you.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye. Bye bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Still see you again.